Is the MD-11 era actually over? Well, in the past few weeks, UPS decided that its MD-11 freighters, already grounded after the tragic Louisville crash in 2025, would never fly cargo again. And other MD-11 operators were expected to follow. But that's not what happened. FedEx went in the opposite direction, announcing that they'll be returning their MD-11s back into service in the coming months. Why? Well, today we're going to take a closer look at the MD-11, go over some news from the accident investigation, and see how industry developments that have nothing to do with the MD-11 could hold the key to its future. And we're going to start with the unceremonious way that UPS announced the fate of their MD-11s. They didn't really make a dedicated announcement. The decision was simply made public when the company published their Q4 2025 earnings report on Tuesday the 27th of January. The relevant quote simply reads, "Regarding the MD-11 aircraft, UPS accelerated its fleet modernization plans, completing the retirement of its MD-11 fleet during the fourth quarter of 2025. UPS added that this decision resulted in an after-tax charge of $137 million due to the write-off of the 26 MD-11s that they still had in service. Now, retiring these jets didn't really come as a surprise. As I'm sure most of you know, all MD-11s and DC-10s in service with airlines or firefighting companies were grounded shortly after the November 4th, 25 crash of UPS flight 2976. But still, retiring a flight isn't a decision that an airline can take lightly. A move like this impacts hundreds of pilots, technicians, engineers, maintenance and parts supply contracts, not to mention the lost capacity that these aircraft represent, that the airline will need to replace, often by wet leasing other freighters or subcontracting part of its operation. It's really hard to measure the impact of the MD-11's retirement on UPS because the company is going through some broader strategic changes which involve cutting 48,000 jobs in 2025 with 30,000 more to be cut in 2026. And we'll come back to that change in strategy later, so keep that one in mind. A couple of weeks before UPS made that announcement, the NTSB released an investigation update on the crash of Flight 2976, which included information on the performance of the engines of the accident aircraft that seemed a little bit overdue. In the preliminary report that the NTSB released about a month after the crash, they hadn't included any information regarding the performance of the aircraft's engines. And this was important, because although we obviously knew that the left engine physically left the aircraft, we didn't know why the plane wasn't able to gain altitude on the remaining two engines. For example, twin-engine airliners like the 737 that I fly are able to safely climb away when they've lost an engine. And there was some speculation that smoke or possibly some debris from the fire that enveloped the left wing was affecting engine number 2, sitting on the tail at the rear of the aircraft. And whilst we still don't know for sure that this was the case, the NTSB's update shows that engine number 2 definitely wasn't behaving as it should. The NTSB report shows that about 3 seconds after the separation of engine number 1 on the left wing, the middle engine's N1 and N2 indications started to fluctuate. Now, modern turbofan engines have 2 or sometimes 3 compressor stages, and the N1 and N2 values tell us how fast each of these stages is spinning. Now, initially, the 2 remaining engines both increased in power to presumably make up for the loss of the left engine. But unlike the right engine that seemed to be running smoothly, the middle engine wasn't operating as it should have done. A truly terrible scenario for the crew. The NTSB also provided more information on the failure mode that led to the engine's separation, which is really important because the nature of this failure will have a key role in determining how and when other MD-11s can return to service. Now, speaking of which, obviously the MD-11 grounding affects aircraft in the FedEx fleet too, and yet just one day after the UPS revealed the retirement of their MD-11s in January, FedEx announced that they plan to return their MD-11 freighters to service by the end of May 2026. The company stated that they're actively working with Boeing and the FAA on the kind of inspections and changes that they would need to make to their aircraft in order to safely return them back into service. And it's worth mentioning at this point that the 29 MD-11s that FedEx still have in their books have an average age of just over 32 years. They're definitely past their prime, but the ones that UPS retired had similar ages too. So why did these two companies treat their old workhorses so differently? Well, it's worth talking a bit here about the role that the MD-11 played in the fleet of these companies. Some of the jets that FedEx and UPS have actually entered service as freighters, but most of them started out carrying passengers. And that's not unusual for many cargo aircraft. But what is a bit unusual for the MD-11s is that their transition from carrying passengers to boxes came quite early on in their type service. And as we've talked about when the preliminary report came out, the MD-11 wasn't as well received by the airlines as McDonnell Douglas had initially hoped. This jet was meant to be a bigger, better and more efficient version of the DC-10 that preceded it, with better avionics and no flight engineer in the cockpit. Unfortunately though, the planes never really delivered the efficiency that McDonnell Douglas had promised. And some of the changes that the company made trying to achieve that efficiency meant that the plane had some unique handling characteristics, especially during takeoff and landing, that may have had a contributing factor in some accidents in the past, and it gave the aircraft a bit of a troubled reputation. Having said that though, pilots that actually flew the type generally speak highly of it. In any case, many passenger airlines got rid of the MD-11 early, which meant that quite a few of them could undergo conversions into freighters when they still had relatively low flight hours on their wings. And since freighters generally fly fewer hours than passenger jets, those 30-year-old aircraft don't have as many flight hours as some jets that are 10 years younger, but have been carrying passengers the whole time. But that raises the question that if these aircraft weren't as efficient as they should have been when they flew passengers, what makes them okay to use when they carry cargo? Well, that's because the factors that make passenger jets profitable are slightly different from those that affect cargo aircraft. I'm oversimplifying things a bit here, but consider this. A passenger flight that's only around half full would still have to fly to its destination because cancelling the flight and compensating those passengers would get really expensive. Plus, after this, the same jet would be needed at the destination airport for a follow-up flight that could still be full. But all of this doesn't apply to freighters, at least not to the same extent. Cargo companies have their own scheduling issues because people still want their parcels to arrive at a certain time. But generally speaking, it's easier for freight carriers to combine and adjust their schedules to avoid flying half-empty jets, especially for trunk routes that nearly always have high demand for cargo. And that means that big jets like the MD-11 could remain profitable much more easily as freighters for companies like FedEx and UPS. So, what does all of this mean for FedEx and the MD-11s that it wants to keep in service? Well, we'll go into that after this. Now, airlines are pretty careful about protecting passenger data, strict regulations, encryption and all that. But when it comes to our own personal information online, most of us are just way less cautious. Ever buy something online and suddenly your inbox and phone are absolute chaos? Not from the company you bought from, but from loads of others you've never even heard of. That's because there's a whole industry built on buying and selling your personal data. So to protect myself, I started using today's sponsor, Incogni, to wipe my data off the internet. Let's say I want to take down any mention of my email address. All I have to do is enter it into Incogni and it will get to work. Behind the scenes, the team tracks down data brokers one by one and demand them to delete my email address from their database. And legally, they have to comply. Now, of course, I could do this myself and they still have to listen. Do I really want to be spending hundreds of hours emailing scammers? Not really. But if I do find a website with my information on it, I just submit it myself through Incogni's custom removals feature and they get onto it in no time. And you can grab it now for 60% off at incogni.com/mentor now or by scanning this QR code. Just remember to use Mentor Now at checkout. Thanks Incogni. Now, let's get back to the video. So, why are FedEx keeping their MD-11s around when UPS is retiring them early? The quick answer is that unlike UPS, FedEx can't afford to retire their jets, at least not for a good few years to come. And to understand this and why UPS and FedEx are thinking so differently about their MD-11 fleets, we need to ask a simple question. What aircraft type are these companies planning to use to replace their MD-11s? Well, size-wise, the MD-11 falls between the freighter versions of the smaller 767 and the larger 777 in both weight and volume. Traditionally, and again I'm oversimplifying a bit here, Most large freight companies put more emphasis on weight because based on the kind of stuff they carry, they run out of available weight capacity before they run out of available volume. So aircraft manufacturers have been designing their freighters with this in mind. And if we compare these aircraft, we'll find that the MD-11 freighter can carry just under 84 tons of cargo, whereas a 777 freighter can handle 102 tons, and the 767 freighter manages just over 51.5 tons. So the MD-11 is a bit closer to the 777 freighter, but not by much. Now, these numbers are approximate and will vary a bit, and that's because there's multiple versions of these aircraft, with differences in maximum takeoff weight, different landing configurations, plus the fact that original freighters and freighter conversions have small differences between them. Anyway, that's what we see when we compare these aircraft by weight capacity. But then there's volume. And the amount of volume that these aircraft can carry has mattered more and more in recent years thanks to the rise in demand for e-commerce cargo. In other words, the boxes of stuff that you and I have been ordering from Amazon and other similar sellers generally aren't very heavy for their volume compared to other more traditional types of cargo. And this is the kind of trade that really boomed during the pandemic years, but it'd been on the rise for many years before that. And that meant for many freight companies that specialize in this type of cargo, their jets fill up to the brim in volume before they run out of available weight, which is why you may hear someone say that this or that cargo aircraft is a good package freighter. And when we compare the same aircraft in volume instead of weight, we actually get very similar results. The MD-11 freighter can carry around 577 cubic meters, which again falls between the 777 freighter's 652.7 cubic meters and the 767 freighter's 445.3. Now, for a full comparison between these jets, we'd need to go into more detail and show how much of this weight they can carry over the same distance, but we're not going to do that today. The point here is that the MD-11 freighter is sized perfectly to have its own very specific niche between the other two jets, both for traditional palletized heavy cargo and for the impulsive online shopping that gets shipped in brown packages. And it's that versatility that kept the type relevant and useful despite its age. But whether or not an airline actually needs this kind of versatility in the size of their fleet is another matter, and that is where FedEx and UPS begin to diverge. FedEx seems to really like keeping a diverse, versatile fleet of jets, and by order of size from smallest to largest, their fleet goes like this: Boeing 737s, 757s, 767s, Airbus A300s, which aren't as old as you might think, and at the top, Boeing's 777s. And that list doesn't include the small turboprops like the ATR 42 and 72 or the even smaller brand new Cessna Sky Courier. Plus, FedEx is still taking deliveries of new 767s and 777s straight from Boeing. But what about UPS? Well, the most noticeable difference in the size category that we're looking at is that UPS doesn't have any 777s. Instead, they have even bigger 747 freighters, mainly the latest 747-8Fs, but also some older -400s and a few conversions. So by retiring their MD-11s, UPS is creating a massive gap in their fleet. From the 767, specifically the 767-300F, they jump up in size straight to the massive Boeing 747. And the company have no plans to add 777s to their fleet anytime soon. And after retiring their MD-11s, they plan to replace them with the much smaller 767. But why? Well, remember when I said that UPS had been making significant job cuts lately? This had a lot to do with the fact that UPS had been shifting its business away from Amazon, and in 2025, the company reduced Amazon-related freight by half. It turned out that even though Amazon was the company's largest single customer, it wasn't their most profitable customer. E-commerce trade comes with high volumes, but it's not always the most profitable kind of business for cargo companies. And at the same time, tariffs and other geopolitical changes in 2025 meant that more emerging e-commerce competitors to Amazon started popping up from China, and let's just say that their prospects don't look as promising now as they did 12 months ago. All of this meant that UPS had to reconfigure and streamline their fleet, and they were likely considering accelerating their MD-11 retirements even before the tragic accident occurred. Their brand new 767-300 freighters are great package freighters, but they're also good all-rounders and much more efficient than the bigger trijets. The 747s should stay busy for some time to come, since they are useful for those really busy trunk routes. And of course, the 747s have that famous party trick, their nose cargo door, which allows them to carry massively oversized cargo that just can't be carried by anyone else, maybe except for the Antonov AN-124. And for that reason alone, I don't think you're going to see 747 cargo jets retiring anytime soon. Okay, so what kind of flying does FedEx actually do that makes the MD-11 still relevant in its fleet? Well, back in March 2025, FedEx announced that they would keep their MD-11s in service till 2032 instead of retiring them at 2028, which was their previous plan. At the same time, they added more orders for Boeing's 777Fs. And this is because the company maintains a very strong presence in many international markets. And in 2025, with changing geopolitics shuffling many markets, FedEx pivoted to new markets in Europe and Asia, linking Asia with Europe in routes that are not subject to any tariffs. And beyond that, some reports suggest that FedEx have already spent more on maintenance on their MD-11s than UPS had in previous years, which means that it may be an easier decision for them to return and keep these jets in service than it would have been for UPS. Not only that, but with many UPS MD-11s now parked and getting parted out for spares, FedEx might even be able to source parts for their own jets a little bit easier. And speaking of maintenance, it's really worth adding here that most MD-11s in FedEx's fleet have GE CF6 engines, which are also used in many other jets, including the brand new 767 freighters that Boeing still delivers today. So despite the age of these aircraft, their maintenance might not be as difficult as those of other similar aged jets. So all of this maintenance capacity plus FedEx's investment in new markets means that the company can't afford to abandon their MD-11s just yet. Whether or not they actually keep them around until 2032 will really depend on how well those new markets look in the next few years. Finally, there is another factor here that's helping the MD-11 stick around even longer than its operators may have previously wished, and that is the really slow progress in the development of Boeing 777-300ER freighter conversions. Even though this jet is bigger than the MD-11, sourcing relatively cheap used 777-300ERs and converting them into freighters was always a key part in retiring the MD-11. Boeing's 777-300ER is the most successful variant of the 777, with very modern and super efficient GE90 engines, the same one used in Boeing's own 777F. But as we've covered in previous videos on the channel, including our recent January news roundup, there are some serious problems with the availability of new wide bodies from both Boeing and Airbus. The two manufacturers still make only around half as many wide bodies as they did in 2019, and they likely won't be able to fix this gap in production until the 2030s. And that's because Boeing has been really slow making 787s because of multiple production and quality issues, and because they consolidated the production of these jets to North Charleston in South Carolina. Airbus has also faced some issues with the longevity, durability and time on wing issues with Rolls-Royce engines for the A330neo and the A350. But most famously of all, Boeing has been really slow getting the 777X certified. The delays are now up to around 7 years and counting, and that's key to our story today because the 777X is the aircraft that several airlines were hoping to replace their 777-300ERs with. Now, Boeing hopes to get the 777X certified later in 2026, but until they do that and they begin deliveries, a lot of 777-300ERs that would have gone into freighter conversion centers are still flying passengers. Israel's IAI has developed and certified the first 777-300ER passenger to freighter conversion, and another such conversion by Mammoth Freighters is also on its way to getting certified. But these conversions take months to complete and won't really accelerate in pace until deliveries of the 777X really get going. Boeing is also developing a freighter based on the new 777 called the 777-8F, but that aircraft certification will have to come after the first passenger 777X variant, the 777-9. And Airbus may be able to beat this into service with the introduction of their next new freighter, the A350F. But again, the MD-11 is smaller than these freighters, both new and 777 conversions. And when a clear path in fixing the MD-11's engine pylon issues is found, the recognisable silhouette of the old trijet could well keep showing up in airports around the world for many years to come. But what do you think? Have you flown in an MD-11 when the type was still flying passengers? And if so, what did you think of it? Let us know in the comments below. I'm Ben Watts, you're watching Mentor Now. Have an amazing week, and I'll see you next time.